What happened? Why'd she leave you? Was she, banging some other guy?
Okay, this is going to be a mammoth video, so let me keep the introduction as short as I can. Like the title suggests, I am a counsellor. I'm going to use the words counsellor, counselling for the most, rather than therapist, psychiatrist, all sorts, just to keep it simple and have consistency. As you'll already know from the title, we're going to analyse a scene from Good Will Hunting, Shawn's first session with Will, and we're going to pretty much do it line by line. But first, the disclaimers. I'm not going to get bogged down discussing what specific trainings I think Shawn uses, because I don't think that's really relevant. It's worth me pointing out here that there's a load of stuff Shawn does that I personally wouldn't do in my training, but that's not what this is about. If it works, that's all that really matters there. Also, although I'm going to draw on psychoanalysis a fair amount, I'm not going to go mental deep with it, because I want this video to be easily understood by everyone, whether you work in the practice or whether you've never had counselling and don't know anything about it. And I think counselling is more about forging a genuine, healthy human relationship with a client, so as such I'm going to try and avoid the psychoanalytic jargon where I can, because it will just confuse you as well, and if you know it already then you'll know where it applies anyway. Welcome to my little thought tree, where we're analysing the very good film Good Will Hunting. And I'm sorry to make this even longer, but before we actually get started on the scene, I do think it's worth a very quick look at the first two counsellors Will sees, the ones who refuse to see him again, Henry and Richard. So Henry's session with Will starts with Will essentially making an interpretation based on some examples Henry gives in his fancy book of counselling.
And Mike was having the same problems that Chad, the stockbroker, was having.
Absolutely right. Right on the button. Good for you, Will. Very nice.
Thank you.
Which kind of sums up Henry, really. Self-indulgent. If I'd written a counselling book and a client came in and started interpreting something from my book, I doubt I'd give him a pat on the head and say, "Well done, you understood my snooty clever book, really well done." It's patronising to Will, which is not a great start at all, because you really need to establish trust with your client from the beginning.
Why is trust the most important thing in making a breakthrough with a client?
But more importantly, it establishes Henry to be just what he looks like from his appearance, full of himself. He's supposed to be interested in Will, who he is, not his own fancy book and how well Will understands it. It's self-indulgent, and in a job that isn't supposed to be about you personally, self-indulgence doesn't really ever help. He then follows this by lecturing Will.
The pressures, and I'm not judging them, I'm not labeling them, but they are destroying your potential. There are no more shenanigans, no more tomfoolery, no more ballyhoo.
I mean, this is a horrendous thing to say, not only to someone like Will, but to any client really. It's the sort of thing a teacher or parent says, the sort of thing authority figures say, and as we know from the film, Will does not get on well with authority figures. It's not the counsellor's role to lecture and tell you what to do. The counsellor's role is to understand and consequently help the client better understand himself.
You're right.
By lecturing like that, you're just giving off the message that you're not interested in understanding them, that you've already decided what they're about despite the fact you barely know them, that all you want is for them to behave. I've talked more about Henry already than I intended, so I'm not going to say anything specific about the hypnotist Richard. I'm just going to condemn the one real fault in both of them. After Henry's kicked Will out, he tells Jerry,
"Hey, you know something? I can't do this pro bono work anymore. It's not worth it."
And equally, when Richard kicks Will out, he says,
"I have better things to do with my time."
As far as I'm concerned, that's not how counselling works. You don't just pick and choose your clients depending on who's worth your time. How high and mighty do you have to think yourself to decide that anyway? The job is about helping people, whoever they are. Not just the easy ones who will make you look good at your job, but the difficult ones too. You help them too, because that's what the job is, helping. It's no surprise in that sense Henry and Richard both fail with Will, because they clearly don't care. And I should caveat that though by saying that there are obviously situations when you have a client that is too difficult for you to handle, that you're not experienced enough for, or you think the client needs a specific specialist or something. Obviously in those situations you refer the client on, but you try to do it tactfully and you work with the client in the process. What you never do is just chuck someone out because I have better things to do with my time. But anyway, to the scene. It starts with Will walking down the stairs, seeing through the glass that Jerry and Tom's this guy, are already in there with Shawn before him. Jerry's explaining to Shawn that it's a
Poker game with this kid.
Normally, I don't think you'd really want the session to start like this. The client arriving to find you talking to his professor or, his parents, teachers, whoever it is, the authority figures. That often gives the client an uneasy feeling of what shit are they spreading about me. Jerry warns Shawn though that he's probably read your book, and as Will enters, Shawn replies to this by joking,
It's gonna be hard for him to find.
which is quite a nice thing for Will to hear really. It's just a simple little parallel the film makes between Shawn and Henry, who was full of himself about his book, where Shawn isn't. Books are going to be a key thing in this scene, but anyway, it's just a small, quite nice thing for Will to hear right off the bat. So, in comes Will. Jerry introduces them as Shawn gets up to say hi, offers his hand for a handshake that gets rejected as Will just plonks himself down into the seat. Shawn doesn't actually respond to this, he just watches for a moment, waiting to see if Will's going to say anything. Shawn, you'll notice when you compare to later scenes in the film, is actually fairly passive in his first meeting with Will, which I think is right. He doesn't know this kid at all, and unlike Henry, he's not going to presume to know nor to judge him. Instead, he's going to just largely listen and take Will in, absorb who he is. It's an incredibly powerful thing when someone does that compared to those situations where you're just talking to someone and you can sense they're not listening, or they're just waiting for their chance to speak, or judging you. It's incredibly powerful when someone just goes, I'm just going to sit back a little and give you space to take the reins, just absorb everything I can. Anyway, we'll see more of that as it unfolds. For now, Shawn says nothing, and it's Jerry who suggests, let's get this started.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm pumped. Let's let the healing begin.
He's mocking therapy, obviously, but it's a mockery that's made specifically because Jerry says, let's get this started. The point is there's something very sciencey and technical about starting a session with let's get started, as though you're about to initiate some great fancy healing process. It's like people who end sessions by saying, I think we're making good progress. That makes me cringe a little because counselling should be more human and down to earth than that. Shawn's style makes it feel more like an ordinary friendly chat, even when there is more going on under the surface. But that's a side note. Will's mocking what he expects Shawn's counselling to be like, and Shawn accepts the mockery. He's just listening and observing for one, and for two he's got a bigger issue right now, which is getting Tom and Jerry out of the room. He asks them to leave. Now this is so obvious that I shouldn't really have to even comment on it. You can't have a session with two other people in the room, you just can't. If it's group or family therapy and that sort of thing, that's different. If you're working with a little kid, there are various reasons you might want the parents to sit in or something, but here, no, absolutely not. You know, this is supposed to be Will's safe space to open up emotionally. How could he ever do that with his professor sitting there? It's mad. Counselling, more than anything else, is about trust, and Will needs to trust that this is his space to talk about whatever he wants. And it's also ideal in this specific instance that Shawn tells him to leave, because Jerry doesn't really care about Will as a person. We see that later in the film. All he really cares about is making Will behave so that he can do all the high level maths Jerry wants him to. By telling them to leave, Shawn is showing, I'm not the same as them two. I'm here to help you, not just do what Jerry wants and make you behave. So now the session actually begins. I said this was going to be a long video, didn't I? I did warn you. Shawn starts with an ordinary friendly smile and says,
How are you?
Will ignores the question and isn't even looking at Shawn. For clients who feel the most offensive or resistant to counselling, this sort of thing is common. Will's essentially avoiding falling into Shawn's dialogue. That's a game of power. You know, if we're going to talk, I'm going to be the one who dictates the topics, not you. Because obviously if Shawn's the one dictating the topics of conversation, there's the fear it might very quickly lead to some deep, very penetrative questions about trauma and childhood and that sort of stuff that Will doesn't want to talk about, so Will can't let that happen. Shawn accepts Will ignoring this and asks another question.
Where are you from in Southie?
Which is meant as a friendly icebreaker really, because that's also where Shawn's from, but again Will ignores it because Will needs to feel in control here. But also there's something else worth touching on here and explaining now, so I don't have to stop later on and cram it in then. And that is to note how much Will attacks Shawn in this scene, just like he attacked the past two counsellors, making a mockery of them, humiliating them to some degree. Attacking people is what Will has done his entire life. I mean, think about it. Will grew up with a violently abusive stepdad. To him, his stepdad is the big evil monster who made Will feel broken and vulnerable in ways he can't even bear to think about. That sort of trauma can stick in your mind if you aren't given space to process it. You start to fear that same sort of evil monster in everyone else. That unless you toughen up and assert your own strength, they'll abuse you and make you feel vulnerable again in all the same ways. So Will attacks people. He can't risk being attacked by them, being thrown back into how things used to be with his stepdad, so he attacks them before they get the chance to do that to him. Attack is the best form of defense quite literally in this scenario. Now does that mean he imagines Shawn might turn around at some point and... No, obviously not. But like I said about the threat of Shawn asking all sorts of penetrative questions about his traumatic past, those questions would feel like an attack for Will. It's not a physical attack, but an emotional or verbal one, psychological. It conjures up the same feelings, the same experience of being made to feel vulnerable and broken beneath another. And you actually see that a little bit in his argument with Skylar.
What are you so scared of?
She asks the sort of questions that do feel like an attack for Will, and as such he has to fight back and trample her down, leaving her feeling like the broken, vulnerable one instead of him. So anyway, having ignored Shawn, Will now plays the role of dictating the conversation by saying,
I like what you've done with the place. Oh, thanks.
He's being condescending, of course. Will doesn't really know anything about Shawn yet, so if he wants to attack him, a good place to start would be by attacking his room, Shawn's office, and so naturally an extension of Shawn to some degree.
Do you buy all these books retail, or do you send away for like a shrink kit that comes with all these volumes included?
I mean, it's a pretty good jab, that one. I think there's a saying, or if not there should be one, that there's often a hint of truth in the jokes we make. One of the counsellor's functions is to try and read the emotional messages behind the words. The message here might read something like, I don't believe you've read all these books. I believe it's just some false effect you're creating to look smart. And if you dig deeper, that message is sort of saying, you don't feel like a genuine person who I can connect with. Maybe Shawn picks up on these hidden meanings, but it is hard to early on in the first session because you're still getting used to the client. If he does pick up on it though, he doesn't comment because it would kind of feel invasive, too much like an attack to do that sort of thing right now. Like I said, all the first session is about is absorbing who Will is, so Shawn just smiles, passively accepting the joke without taking any offence, and asks in a friendly way,
Do you like books? Yeah.
Personally, I think there's something quite competitive or confrontational about the eye contact and body language of Will here. To him, it's not just a friendly chat about books, it's a game of power, a game of, have you read as much as me, are you as smart as I am? And let's just look at this a bit.
Did you read any of these books?
I don't know.
How about any of these books?
Probably not.
If this is a competition in Will's eyes, technically he's losing now because he hasn't read those books. But he says probably not with a derisive laugh, as though of course he hasn't read them. He knows better than to waste his time on those pathetic books, which is really just a clever way of turning his defeat into a victory here.
What about the ones on the top shelf? You read those?
And honestly, you could argue this isn't Shawn being particularly friendly anymore, because it is a bit odd how much he pushes the point about the books Will has read. You can see why it might come across confrontational or competitive, so, I mean, what is Shawn doing? Why does he keep asking about the books? Why does he keep pushing that point? Well, the way I see it, Shawn is trying to be friendly. Will initiated the conversation about books before then moving to light a cigarette, so rather than letting the conversation die away as Will focuses on his cigarette, he's trying to keep it going. Will has dictated the topic though, books, and Shawn happily accepts to stick to that topic. What I also think could be going on here is an attempt to effectively address an elephant in the room, that Will is no ordinary client, he's a genius, who has indeed read a ton of books with an incredible ease and memory. Shawn is in some ways clearing the air on this fact. I know you're a genius, I know you read extensively, so let me ask in a friendly, indirect way about your geniusness. I think geniusness is the word. And yeah, you can say that if that's what Shawn's doing, it's an odd, indirect way of going about it, but Shawn has already asked 2 direct questions at this point, and both of them were ignored, so maybe an indirect approach is better right now. And I'd say it is, because Will does respond now. He glances up at the shelf and says,
Yeah, I read those.
Good for you. What do you think about them?
Hey, I'm not here for a fucking book report. They're your books. Why don't you read them?
In Will's mind, he's interpreted this conversation like it's a book report, like Shawn is trying to be some English teacher testing the knowledge of his lowly student. The fact Will sees it that way is interesting. It adds to the whole game of power idea, because it's hard for Will to imagine that they could have a simple, friendly conversation right now. It's hard for him to imagine he doesn't need to play a game of power to assert his dominance in any situation with anyone. Let me reference one biased opinion who gave a beautiful reply to a comment I wrote about this scene elsewhere on YouTube. It's a reflection of what he's seen all his life. People who are authority figures look down on him for any number of reasons, holding up their accomplishments and possessions as walls that he can't possibly overcome. That's why he sees it like a book report, because in his eyes, Shawn is just another authority figure out to crush or belittle Will. Thanks to his unique mind, however, Will has exactly the right tools to fight back against this and takes great pleasure in doing so. That's the game of power with Will. He uses his geniusness to outsmart everyone else, to humiliate them. That's not how it has to be though. It doesn't need to be a war or a game of power with every interaction. But anyway, I'm half repeating myself there, so let's move on. The other thing we see in that line is Will dictating the topic of conversation again. Talking about books is good, it's safe, it doesn't feel too personal, but now Will would rather they directed the book conversation back towards Shawn. Let's have less about the books I've read and more about the ones you have. In some ways, it's a very small moment of turning the counselling against the counsellor. Will wants to see if Shawn is comfortable answering the sort of questions he expects Will to answer. And the conclusion?
They're your books, why don't you read them? I did. I had to.
Yeah, he is. You know, Shawn isn't boasting about his intelligence like Will expects him to, nor is he self-indulging like Henry did, nor is he trying to prove himself smarter and look down on Will. He's just being honest. I read those books, not because I wanted to, but because I had to for my training. To reference One Biased Opinion's reply again, these books aren't Shawn's superiority statement, and they're not. In Shawn's reply here, he's making that point very clear to Will. And you might notice, of course, that this also loops back to answering the first question Will asked.
Do you buy all these books retail, or do you send away for like a shrink kit that comes with all these volumes included?
And Shawn is now pretty much saying, I did read them all, but not for the effect, simply because I had to.
Must have taken you a long time. Yeah, it did.
Shawn says, again, not as a boast. There's a sigh as he says this. It was hard work he didn't particularly enjoy. Now, there's always something my tutor used to say about counselling, that whenever something odd or big or interesting happens in a session, try and remember and notice the thing that happened right before it. However small or inconsequential it may seem, you know, what set it off? Because right after Shawn saying that, there's an interesting pause where Will looks at Shawn, not in a confrontational way now, but actually looks at him as though Shawn is a real person. Then he looks at his books before springing out of his chair to get a better view of them, but it's a very small, very brief moment of connection between them. Shawn has said something that Will hasn't tried to bat away, to ridicule, to outsmart or ignore. Shawn has said something that he's actually taken in. It is just a brief moment though. I mean, of course it's brief. This is the first session. Will expects confrontation and games of power with everyone he encounters. You're not going to change that after one simple comment. He reads one book on the shelf. He shakes his head a little, then notices a picture of Shawn in the army. Now, he doesn't comment on his army photo at all. There's grounds to see it differently, but I think he doesn't comment because it's an area of expertise where Shawn outranks Will. Logically, if Will doesn't want to be outsmarted, he's not going to bring up a topic of conversation where Shawn knows more than him. What he does comment on, however, is the books. He says,
You want to read a real history book, read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That book will fucking knock you on your ass.
Better than Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent? You think that's a good book?
and now we can question, is Shawn getting involved in a game of power? Is he competing with Will's intellect here? And really you can look at it one or two ways. Maybe it's a bit of both. Either he's showing Will that he has some firmness, that he can't just be pushed over and trampled on, you know? If you want to start spouting about the books you've read, I can keep up. And that's probably a good thing, but like I've said, you can also see this as Shawn getting drawn into Will's game of power. Because this is something else worth taking a moment to explain. We make happen the stuff we fear will happen. Or, as people often sum it up, we're the architects of our own demise. Darren Brown, if you know him, always talks about the little stories we tell ourselves about who we are.
We tend to dwell on our past and we think they somehow define who we are. But our pasts are just stories that we tell ourselves in the present. Yes? When we say, I'm this sort of person because this happened to me, or I'm a lucky person or an unlucky person. Whatever it is, they're just stories. And we can be more skeptical of those stories if it helps us. See, if this were the start of a film, and it said based on a true story, you would know that the events that were going to happen in that film were not real events exactly as they happened, but a kind of tidied up version, with a neat beginning, middle, and an end, and so on. Yes, you'd be naturally skeptical. In the same way you come and see this show, you know that I'm going to sometimes sell you a story that isn't quite true, because that's what we've agreed to, yes? You are naturally skeptical. We forget to apply the same natural skepticism to the most important stories we have, the ones we tell ourselves every day about who we are. And we can choose to change those stories.
To simplify one of Will's little stories, you could say it's that people with power will beat, abuse and make me vulnerable if I give them the chance. That's what my stepdad did, that's what I've grown up knowing. People with power are out to break me. And like I've already said, he acts to try and stop this happening by asserting his own power, railing against those with authority to beat down them before they can beat him. That's the defence, but the thing is, as a contradiction, we make happen the things we fear will happen. By railing against those with power, he draws them into retaliating. They get wound up enough by Will's attacks to want to fight back. And we see that throughout the film. The cops he hits hit him back, the judge he argues with sends him down, the counsellors kick him out, and even Shawn will grab him by the throat near the end of this scene. So, yeah, Will ignores the question and just says,
Can people baffle me?
I mean, there is a bit of sting in that. You people, the not quite real, almost robotic therapists. He started walking around the edges of the room now as well, which clients can often do in the first session. It's a thing of testing the space really, similar to animals, you know, partly checking the surroundings are safe, partly, let's say leaving your scent, asserting your dominance over it.
Spend all your money on these fucking fancy books you surround yourselves with.
He sneers, which you'll notice is a return to his first question about the shrink kit. He's cycled back to that same point, which clients, or well, all of us do a lot. But anyway, it's an interesting point Will makes that now deserves some closer attention. The implication of surrounding yourselves with the books implies the books are armour, like Shawn's created a fortress out of his books to defend himself. And all you have to do is ask the question, well, why would Will see Shawn's books like that? And it's because Will is familiar with the idea of surrounding yourself with books as a defence. AKA, it's exactly what Will does. Will tries to hide all his pain behind his genius, turn all the great authors he reads into his defence. Sometimes the things we attack in others are the things we notice in ourselves. Sometimes the things we attack in others are a way of attacking the parts of ourselves we don't like. And if you want to take this line even further, think about the dickhead ponytail bloke in that bar who, in a much more exaggerated way than Will, also hides behind the defence of his books and clever lines he's read.
Evolution of the market economy in the southern colonies.
Now think about the famous park bench scene where Shawn tells Will,
I ask you about war, you'd probably throw Shakespeare at me, right? Once more into the breach, dear friends. But you've never been near one.
He's telling Will the exact thing Will tells that dickhead bloke.
Do you have any thoughts of your own on this matter?
The exact thing Will is currently sneering at Shawn for. Surrounding himself with books.
I can't learn anything from you. I can't read in some fucking book. Unless you want to talk about you.
But anyway, the line goes further than that.
Spend all your money on these fucking fancy books you surround yourselves with them. They're the wrong fucking books.
What are the right fucking books, Will?
You know, he's mirrored Will's language here, showing that he's perfectly comfortable with swearing. With Will talking however he wants to talk, in a way you can imagine Henry wouldn't be comfortable. But also this is God knows how many times Will has insulted Shawn so far, and not once has Shawn got offended. He just asks to know what the right books are, to learn more about Will, to understand the books Will approves of. Will's not going to let himself get drawn into opening up anything personal about himself though, so he just responds with a dead stock phrase.
Hey, whatever blows your hair back.
Yeah. Haven't got much hair left.
Which is Shawn showing his humour again. And this whole time, Will has been smoking a cigarette, but Shawn waits until an opening to comment on it. I mean, he could have interrupted Will talking earlier to point out the rule, we can't have smoking in here, but he doesn't, because Will was expressing something at the time, and Shawn's main job right now is to listen and absorb Will.
Hey, you know you'd be better off shoving that cigarette up your ass. It'd probably be healthier for you.
It's a much more passive way of establishing a rule than just stating, you can't smoke in here in that sense. Will wants to smoke though. It helps to assert his dominance, particularly now Shawn's asked him not to. I mean, what better way to assert your power than to ignore what you've been asked to do? So Will deliberately ignores the instruction and reads Shawn's message solely as a joke.
Yeah, I know, it really gets in the way of my yoga.
And that's all that's said about this rule. Which is fine, you know, this is the first session. Shawn's pointed out the rule, but he doesn't expect Will to follow it yet. This isn't the time for that. You know, I'm giving him space to express who he is, and if a part of that is to express rebellion, then that's okay.
You work out, huh? What, you lift?
Says Will, directing Shawn's own question right back on him. He even sits back in his seat and gives Shawn clear eye contact. Shawn passively accepts the tables being turned again and answers the questions happily.
Yeah. And Nautilus?
No, free weights.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Free weights, huh?
Yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Just like that.
What do you bench?
285. What do you bench?
Like I said earlier, either you can see this positively as Shawn showing Will he can keep up with his competition and game of power, or you can see it negatively that he allows himself to get sucked into the game at all. But let's think about Will's reaction to this. Shawn just outdid Will, beat him in competition, physical competition as well, and Will reacts by essentially sticking the knife in. Well, first he ignores Shawn's question.
You paint that?
Once he realises that Shawn painted it himself, he realises this could be one of Shawn's weak spots. This is my point about the negative of getting drawn into Will's game of power. Firstly, because if you retaliate, Will then has to retaliate back himself, escalating the situation to a whole nother level as we're about to see. Secondly, it plays into that little story running in the back of Will's mind, that everybody is out to beat, abuse and take him down. How you help break that narrative is by not taking part in it yourself, by demonstrating that not every interaction Will has to end that same way. It's no criticism of Shawn that he gets drawn into the game of power though, because that's what happens. It takes an incredible awareness and patience to resist the kind of roles that clients can sort of unconsciously pressure you into playing.
Yeah. You paint? Do you sculpt?
No.
You like art? You like music?
The painting does mean something personal to Shawn, and he feels wary of an attack coming, hence all these quick-fire questions, you know, trying to distract Will from the painting, trying to bring him away from it, back to their conversation. You can even hear a little tension in his voice.
It's a real piece of shit.
Shawn takes it on the chin because, well, I mean, he should. If Shawn gets upset, it'll only encourage Will because it will reveal just how much of a weak spot it is. If Shawn gets angry, it'll only escalate the game of power to a higher level. If Shawn acts like he doesn't care and pretends it means nothing, Will keep digging deeper, trying to really hurt Shawn. So Shawn does what he should do in this situation now. He accepts it. He absorbs the blow rather than deflecting it.
Oh, well, tell me what you really think.
Just the linear and impressionistic mix makes a very muddled composition.
And it's here Shawn finally gets out of his chair. I've touched on the physical game that's being played out and Will's movements around the room, but I haven't directly addressed it yet. The centre of the room, sitting in those two chairs, is where the session happens. That's where Shawn asks questions about Will, and Will is supposed to open up about stuff that makes him emotional. As I've already said though, Will wants to avoid this sort of conversation, and one good way of avoiding it is to physically avoid the middle of the room and to avoid sitting in that chair. It's a bit like delaying the session from actually starting, and now he's even been able to get Shawn out of the centre of the room.
It's also a Winslow Homer ripoff, except you got Whitey rowing the boat there.
Again, Shawn tries to absorb the blow, passively admitting.
Well, it's a hard one, eh? It wasn't very good.
Will isn't done, however.
That's not really what concerns me, though.
What concerns you?
It's the coloring.
You know what the real bitch of it is? It's paint by number.
He interrupts like he's hoping it will deter Will from attacking.
Is it color by number? Because the colors are fascinating to me.
Are they really? What about that?
More humour again. Perhaps it's a little too much here because it sounds slightly sarcastic. You know, self-deprecating humour is fine because it's attacking yourself, not the client. Sarcasm, not so effective. It's not an issue, really, it's just a bad bit of humour that doesn't quite land and causes Will to swing round and say,
I think you're about one step away from cutting your fucking ear off.
This is Will straight up threatening, testing Shawn. I mean, I know it's a Van Gogh reference with a bit of humour, but Will is still telling Shawn to step back here. And when someone threatens you like that in real life, you might be inclined to step back and apologise, aka Will wins. Or to stand firm and threaten Will back, aka escalate things. But Shawn finds the third option again, which is to accept the threat without showing any submission.
Think I should move to the south of France, change my name to Vincent?
Anyway, Will's criticised the technical skill of the painting to minimal success, but he's seen enough from Shawn's flinching and the fact it's got him out of the chair that clearly there is something personal about this painting. So now he tries interpreting it emotionally.
You ever heard the saying, any port in a storm?
Yeah.
And this is a key moment because it's, again, turning the counselling on the counsellor. Something important to say is we tend to make others feel the way we feel. Will makes Shawn feel the way Will fears Shawn will make him feel, if you can follow what I just said. Will's idea of what a counsellor will do is rip apart his life with a very deep, clinical interpretation that punctures right to the centre, really dissects you. In reality, no good counsellor ever does that, because you're not trying to cause your client to have a breakdown. You're careful when and how deep to interpret things, because you want your client to be able to take it in. You want it to be a thing of positive growth, not something that destroys them. Naturally though, there can be this fear that the counsellor might destroy you at any moment with some crazy deep interpretation. That's what Will expects Shawn to do, so he turns that same thing against him. Will makes the sort of invasive, painful interpretation that he expects Shawn will make about him.
Maybe you're in the middle of a storm, a big fucking storm. Yeah. The sky's falling on your head, the waves are crashing over your little boat, the oars are about to snap. You're just pissing your pants, you're crying for the harbor, so maybe you did what you gotta do to get out. Maybe you became a psychologist.
If you watch Shawn during this, you can see he feels uncomfortable, so Will is at least partly right. I would say the part he's right about is that it is a very sad painting that expresses a lot of loneliness and a feeling of being lost. The big storm, the waves crashing, all's about to snap. Will's right there. Personally, I'd imagine the painting is more to do with Shawn's mourning after his wife's death. I'd guess that's when he painted it. That's why there's only one person in the boat who feels lonely and lost and without any direction. Without his wife, Shawn feels lost at sea. Will gets that bit wrong though, and this is what's very interesting about it. Will imagines Shawn was lost at sea in his younger life, while he was still growing up when he painted this, still figuring out what to do with his life, what career path to take, and he felt lost, so he just settled for whatever first came to mind, becoming a psychologist. But that interpretation, does it not say more about Will than Shawn? Considering Will's position in this film, he's still growing up, he feels lost in his life. Sure, he's happy with his friends and he has a good time, but he knows he's a genius who could do so much more. But what more? What job does Will follow, or what love?
You can do anything you want. You are bound by nothing. What are you passionate about? What do you want?
Will feels afraid to really take any leaps in his life, so he settles for the simplest, most obvious thing.
You live in this safe little world where no one challenges you and you're scared shitless.
Stay in Boston, surrounded by the same friends, live in the same house doing simple jobs and never dare leave. If anyone's a port in a storm, it's Will. And so in trying to attack Shawn, Will has inadvertently revealed the exact sort of feelings that he's so afraid to show.
Bingo. That's it.
Again, passively accepting Will's attack.
Let me do my job. No, you start with me. Come on.
Which is his attempts to bring them both back to the chairs and actually start the session. Like, okay, you've got your attacks in, you've asserted yourself a bit, I've given you space to do that, so now let's get back to the actual work.
Maybe you married the wrong woman.
Maybe you should watch your mouth.
Will gets an attack that finally does land, like he was hoping for. Shawn's wife. And you see that faint grin Will's got as he turns to face Shawn again, because this is what he's wanted all the time. To get under Shawn's skin, to get him angry so that he kicks Will out. Another counsellor defeated by the great Will.
Watch it right there, Chief, alright?
Will turns his face back to the painting again and continues, because he's close now. A little further, push a little more, and he'll have his victory.
You married the wrong woman. What happened? Why'd she leave you? Was she, banging some other guy?
There's genuine fear in Will's face right now, which is unsurprising. I mean, you would be scared shitless if your counsellor of all people attacked you. More so, of course, you could say Will knows this experience all too well from his stepdad. Maybe this right now evokes similar feelings in him. That sense of dread and helplessness he might have felt as a kid. There's a nice change you see in Will's face though as this moment plays out. He goes from that sense of dread to a cold, defensive kind of numbness. His eyes go a bit dead, like he's walled the feeling off now. He stares coldly at Shawn and announces,
"Time's up."
And if we're talking about a game of power again, Will has won. And the look of slight horror on Shawn's face as he realises what he's just done, then the sadness that follows shows Will has won. He got everything he wanted. He affected Shawn and brought an end to the session. He leaves somewhat triumphantly while Shawn is left brooding over his painting.
At ease, gentlemen.
So there's a few more things to explain before we can end. One is some added context as to why Will tried to end the session, and the other is what separates the ending here to the ending in Henry's and Richard's sessions. Now, in terms of why Will tried to get himself chucked out, I've said a lot on it already, but there's rarely ever just one reason for anything, so let me add an extra one that I think is almost always important when you do get clients who want to end sessions. It's the fact Will expects people to give up on him. Abandon him, leave him, turn against him.
You might find out something about me you don't like, and, maybe you wish you hadn't said that, but it's such a serious thing that you can't take it back, and now I'm stuck in California. Someone doesn't really want to be with me, just wish they had a take back.
This is part of the little story in the back of Will's mind. People abandon me, leave me, turn against me. You have enough experiences of that in your life, particularly if it's in your childhood, and you'll start to expect it from every single relationship you're in, whether that's romantic, family, friends, teacher, even therapist. Being abandoned is scary and very painful. It's not something you want to experience again in the future, so how do you defend yourself against it? Well, first you try not to get too close to anyone, but second, if it turns out you are getting close, you abandon them before they can abandon you. Save yourself the real pain by ending things early, like how Will ends it with Skylar.
I don't love you.
So that's a pattern in Will's life. You could argue with me here and say, but surely that's the opposite of what's happening with the counsellor, because Will doesn't kick himself out, they kick him out. They are the ones who abandon and give up on him. And yes, they do. And that's partly because Will has to go to counselling by order of the judge, so he can't leave himself. The counsellor has to make him leave. But also he's made them kick him out before any relationship is built up, before they could get close to him, before such a time where it would be painful to be kicked out. It's a bit like he's saying, when people get to know the real me, they hate me and give up on me. So I might as well show them my worst straight away so we can get this over and done with. If you're going to kick me out, do it now. Thirdly, there's the fact we are, like I said, the architects of our own demise. We make happen the things we fear will happen. We do that because it proves we're right. If your little story is that people abandon you, you might wind them up until they lose their temper and abandon you, so you can then say, aha, I knew it, people always do abandon me, I was right all along, oh why is the whole world so cruel to me? It's what we're used to, it's familiar, and that makes it seem kind of safe in a way, even if it's what we fear as well. And fourth, there's the fact you can turn that painful feeling of being abandoned into something less painful, into a triumph. Will does that. He's pleased to be kicked out because it means he's got one over on Shawn. He's smarter. He's better in a kind of emotional sparring match because it's Shawn who comes away feeling upset and angry, not Will. And that's a very shallow victory, that, but it's enough of a victory to hide the deeper pain that no one can ever stand me. So the final thing, what separates Shawn from Henry and Richard? We know Shawn's a better counsellor, we've seen him achieve much more already. I mean, think about it, he did actually get a bit of genuine dialogue with Will at times. He has learned a few small things like particular books Will likes and reads, the fact he lifts, the fact they can have small moments of shared humour, the fact Will knows about art and everything Will has inadvertently revealed through his interpretation of the painting. And they do have moments where they do sort of get along, even if Will does quickly revert back to his defensiveness. So if it wasn't for the whole grabbing him by the throat thing, it might not have been a bad session. But he does grab him by the throat and end the session, which is even worse than just kicking him out. So doesn't it all come to the same conclusion as them anyway? No, it doesn't. Because this is what really separates Shawn from them. This is where we come back to everything I criticised both those counsellors for earlier. They don't give a shit about Will, where Shawn does. Because Jerry comes back in and Shawn tells him,
Thursday, 4 o'clock. Make sure the kid's here.
That's the difference. Even when Will drives Shawn to violence and to a night spent drinking and depression, even then, Shawn will still see him again. Now what does that say to someone who expects to be abandoned? Shawn won't give up on him no matter what. I mean, if you don't give up on someone after all that, after seeing Will at his very worst, how will you ever give up? That's an incredibly powerful thing to experience, because sure, it is important to set boundaries, and Shawn has a very clear boundary now that Will won't dare break again. Don't disrespect his wife. But even when he does, even when Will shows Shawn his absolute worst, I will still be here to see you. I won't hold a grudge, I will forgive and we will move forwards together. It's powerful to see someone would care that much. Shawn cares. And what's more, it breaks the cycle. It breaks the endless pattern and shows Will that there can be other ways to interact with people. That it can be possible to have an open relationship without it ending in abandonment. And it also gives off another incredibly powerful message that we could all do with learning at some point in our lives. When things break down and go wrong, they can be repaired. You know, when you fall out with someone, you can pick up and get on again. When you have an argument with your girlfriend, you can resolve it and come back into love. And when you even drive your counsellor to the point of violence, you can still repair and carry on. That's the simple message. Things can be repaired. We're all told that as kids, but some of us are unfortunate and don't experience it. And if you don't experience it, then just being told things can be repaired doesn't really mean much at all. But we are capable of genuine, true repair, even if we don't believe it yet. And sometimes you just need the experience of a relationship being repaired, fully repaired, where old wounds aren't even ones you drag up again, to give you that belief. Shawn's done that for Will now. To manage even that small little thing for someone else's life can be immense. So I said this would be a long one, didn't I? Thanks for sticking around. This is a re-upload where I've had to remake the entire video again because the original clips and audio got lost and it wasn't the best quality anyway. I do feel going through it again though that I didn't criticise Shawn as much as I could have done because he's not perfect. And if you ever did physically attack a client, I mean, that would be it. You'd be struck off. It'd be a terrible thing. So you have to keep in mind this is a movie. It's not real life exactly. Even if there's a lot of stuff we can analyse and draw from it that which is like real life, it's still a movie in that sense. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you fancy it. And hopefully see you next time.